Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're here with another video to help you improve your chess game. You can subscribe to the channel, you can like the videos, but please tell your chess friends about the channel Dan Heisman Chess. We've won the award from the Chess Journalists of America for best instruction multiple times, but we just need to get the word out there better. So let's see if we can get a bunch of views from helping people learn about the channel. Dan Heisman Chess is the name of the channel. Okay, we're going to look at a game that was played last week at our club. It's really instructive. If you've ever had a game where you were kind of winning easily, but you had to find some accurate moves and you came up with the wrong plan, this is the game for you, because White was winning this game pretty easily at the end of the game, and then he just continued to find the wrong idea, and he threw away, and then it was a draw, and then he made one quick move. He was short on time, but not that short on time, and he made one quick move, and then he went from a draw to a loss. So he went from a win to a draw to a loss. Let's see how that happened. Okay, the first move of the game was e4. Black played Caro-Kann c6. White played the main line d4, d5, and White plays now what's called the Panna-Botvinnik attack. He trades the pawns and plays c4, Panna-Botvinnik attack. You can see over there on the right in the database, master database, it says Caro-Kann defense. It cuts it off here, but it says Panna attack. I call it the Panna-Botvinnik attack. All right, Black plays one of the main lines. 97% of the games is knight f6 here, and he plays knight f6. White plays knight c3, and now Black should play something like knight c6 or e6. Those moves are played together 81% of the time. He makes a common beginner mistake, which is to bring out the bishop too early and plays bishop f5, and White understands the right way to punish that. White immediately makes a double attack and plays the best move, queen to b3. If you've never seen this idea before and you're a d4 player, you should learn this, because bishop f5 is a common idea from amateurs in these kind of positions, but already White's practically winning. He's threatening the d5 pawn 3 times, and he's threatening the b7 pawn, and Black doesn't have any really wonderful defenses to both of those threats. All right, so Black takes the pawn, and now White has to decide whether he wants to take on b7 or take the pawn with bishop takes c4, which would threaten bishop takes f7 check and queen takes b7. Engine says it doesn't matter, but he plays bishop takes c4. Now Black has to stop bishop f7 check, so he does with e6, but he loses the b7 pawn, and already White's pretty much winning. The engine gives it at 0.9, but there's a lot of game left to be played, as we well know. All right, knight bd7, and now you want to get out your pieces in castle. White decides to try to stop rook to b8, which isn't really much of a threat, but his move's very good. White plays bishop f4. Black now should get ready to castle himself. The engine likes a5 here, which is kind of a strange move. I would probably play something like bishop e7, which the computer says is just losing. He plays knight b6, and now White has all kinds of good ideas. He can play bishop b5 check. He can play bishop c7. They're both winning. He plays bishop b5 check. Black blocks, say that quickly. Black blocks with the f knight. And now bishop c7, forcing the trade of queens. Queen to c8, and now the best move is to play bishop to a6, threatening to win some material. And of course, if queen takes b7, bishop takes b7, the rook on a8 would then be trapped, and White would win the exchange. So bishop to a6 is the best move. Bishop to c6 also guards the queen, but it doesn't threaten as much because it's not attacking c8. It is attacking a8, but you can't take on a8 because the knight's guarding it. So bishop to c6, not the most accurate. Still White's way better. Black develops his bishop. And now White plays a strange move. Bishop takes b6, giving up the bishop pair, I guess trying to remove the guard on the rook. So, okay, that makes some sense then. So he plays bishop takes b6. But he has to calculate the lines. Well, the only really lines Black can play is either take the knight on c3 or trade queens and then skewer the bishop. So he probably missed the skewer. If he had seen the skewer, he probably would have played a developing move. White should definitely want to start thinking about castling here. The engine suggests knight e2 is the best move. All right, so bishop b6, and now black has to play this right. Instead, black blunders and plays rook to b8. But that's hopeless. Now he's down an entire piece. All white has to do is trade queens, take the knight with check. So he could play queen takes c8 check, rook takes c8, and then bishop takes d7 check, and then play something like bishop to c5, and resigns is good. So I'm not sure how black survived this. Let's see what white played. He played queen takes c8 check. The engine says bishop takes d7 check. First is more accurate. So when you see a good move, look for a better one. This is a good counting problem. We should add this maybe to the possibility of our next counting chess course in Chessable. We have one already called Can You Take It? So queen takes c8 is definitely winning. Bishop takes d7 check, removing the guard on the rook is even better because he can't take with the king. He has to take with the queen, and then queen takes b8 check. So you have multiple winning lines here. When you have multiple winning lines like this, you want to take your time, try to find the most accurate one. So queen takes c8 is the first move I saw, but it's not the best move. Rook takes, bishop takes, king takes, and now just save the bishop. And I suggested bishop to c5, blocking the rook from hitting the knight on c3. If you play bishop takes a7, which white played in the game, that's a big blunder because then black can play rook takes c3, and he's winning a piece because on b takes c3, bishop takes c3 check. Now white's not a bad player, so how he could miss the fact that bishop c5 is just ending the game. That's the move I originally saw when I looked at queen takes c8 check. Bishop takes a7 is terrible. So he plays bishop takes a7, and black, of course, finds rook takes c3. If white didn't see that, then that's hope chess. You don't want to play a move and then black play a move or check capture a thread and then go, uh-oh, what do I do now? The answer is too late. You just threw away your big advantage. And now the best you can do is just give up the piece, which he does. King e2, bishop takes a8. So instead of being up an entire piece, white's only up a pawn. So that's a big difference. So now white's made two big tactical errors. Queen takes c8 was a good move, but even better was bishop takes d7 check. But bishop takes a7 was a horrible move, throwing away an easy win, and now white's just much better at 0.9. He's not a... If you go back a couple moves, if white had played bishop c5 here, the move that I wanted to play, you can see the engine on the right has white up by 4.4 pawns. After bishop takes a7, rook takes c3, instead of 4.4, it's 1.0, which of course is right on the borderline of winning or not. All right, so king e2, bishop takes a1. White finally develops the knight. Black gets the bishop back. And now white should... Oh, white's winning. Why? Let's see. Bishop to c3 is a blunder. Why is bishop c3 a blunder? I didn't see that right away. The computer says bishop b2 is the best move. Bishop c3 loses. Wow, that's interesting. I guess it's because after knight e5 check, the king doesn't have any great squares. If he goes to the c file, he can be pinned. And if he goes to the e7, I guess we can get the rook in with tempo. That's really interesting. I did not see that. All right, so knight e5 check, king e7. And now the winning move is rook to c1, threatening rook c7 check. Let's take a look at that line. If you play rook c1, the problem for black is he can't play bishop a5 to stop rook c7 check, because then knight to c6 check wins the bishop. So the only place the bishop can go that doesn't allow knight c6 check is to play bishop to b7. I guess he could play rook a8 first, but then bishop c5 check followed by rook takes c3. So let's look at bishop to b2. Then rook c7 check. All right, Mr. Mouse, let's go all the way up. And now he's in big trouble. If he goes to d6, then rook d7 is checkmate right in the middle of the board. Very cute. It's a checkmate with the pawn, the knight, and the rook. You don't even need the bishop to guard c5 because the pawn's doing that. But what else could he do? If he plays king to d8, the engine says the best move is to play bishop b6, guarding the rook, threatening discovered attacks, and threatening knight f7 check, and you can't meet all the threats. But if you move your king to f6, he's got rook f7 check. If you move your king to e8, he's got rook c7 check, rook c8 check, skewering the rook. Okay, let's go back to the game. So white plays bishop c5 check, which is not as good. Black plays the only defense, king to f6. Now rook c1. But see, this is a big difference. You're no longer skewering the bishop on c3 to the c7 square. So the rook can't really get in the game. The bishop on c5 is in the way, and rook c7 is not a check anymore. So that makes all the difference. Although white's still winning. Bishop to a5. White, the computer likes either knight d7 check or king e3. King e3 is a nice solid move. White plays f3. I guess he wants to play g4 and trade some things off here. Black plays h5 to stop g4, but white could still play g4. In some lines, the engine says h4 is the best move. White decides to get his pass pawn rolling with a4. Black says, I'll play g5, which gets my kingside pawns rolling and gives my king another square. Now white plays knight d7 check. King to g7. I didn't see any of this part of the game. I came back later when things got very interesting. Bishop to e7. Well, that's kind of a silly threat of bishop f6 check because you're almost forcing black to move the rook, which he wants to do anyway. And he plays bishop d8. The computer says rook to a8 was pretty much getting back toward the drawing lines. So bishop d8. By the way, the ratings of these players, I think white is about 1600 and black is a little bit lower, maybe 1400. So white takes, black takes, white plays rook c7. Black gets the king out of the way, but now the f7 pawn is weak. White can play knight e5. But then rook takes d4, so I guess that's not so good. So why don't you just play king e3 first, guarding the pawn, threatening knight e5. The engine says even better is to just run that a pawn down the board with a5, and that's what white plays. Black plays his best move, rook a8, going after the pawn. White, of course, guards the pawn. Black hits the knight. Here the knight could go to b8 or e5. He plays to b8 to help the pawn promote. Black hits the knight. White saves the knight. Black plays check. Now you have a choice. Do you want to give him the g2 pawn and keep your king in the middle? Or do you want to go back and guard the g2 pawn with king to f1, allowing bishop d3 check? White makes the right decision. He says, go ahead and take my kingside pawns because I can get a queen. So he plays the best move, king e3. Black's kind of lost here. He decides to take the pawn. White plays the best move, a6. That pawn's threatening to become a touchdown. Notice how the bishop on f5 is not a defender of the queen side. So it's really a rook, a knight, and a pawn against the rook. So black plays e5 to try to get the bishop into the line. The computer says white should just play d5 and get another pass pawn. But it says lots of moves win. So d takes e5. Black says, good, now my bishop can get back into the defensive area. White says, I'm going to win something very soon with a7. Black plays bishop to b7. Now the computer likes knight to a5. Knight to a5 does two things. Number one, it hits the bishop and threatens to move the rook up. If the bishop stays on the diagonal, then white can play rook to c8 if the bishop stays on the a8 to h1 diagonal. But on the other hand, knight a5 also blocks the rook on g2 from coming back to a2 and hitting the a8 square. So knight a5 does two things. The computer says white's move, knight d8, is just as good, but knight a5 is a little conceptually easier. All right, so knight to d8. The bishop goes to a8. The rook goes to c8, and the bishop goes to d5. All right, I wasn't watching the game at this point, but white is a fairly slow player, and I guess he was getting a little low on time here. And here he played the obvious a8 queen. If you have some time, if you're playing this game and you want to play a move that's better than a8 queen to just win the bishop, can you find the better move? White to play and play the best move. If you look at the engine, of course, it'll give you the answer. All right, you can pause the video if you want to find it. If not, I'll show it to you. Here's the right idea. The right idea, it's not that A8 doesn't win. It does win. But even an easier win is to play knight c6, block the bishop from taking that pawn to get a queen. That means that black would have to stop the pawn with the rook. For instance, if he plays bishop takes to try to bring the rook over, rook takes c6 is check, and that check is critical because it gives white time to play a8 queen because the rook can't come over because he's in check. So therefore, the only move here is to play rook to a2. And now when you get the queen, and he takes the queen, and you take back with the rook, if you say, well, that's not as good, you're winning a rook, but you're losing a knight, you're only winning the exchange, and the other way you're winning a piece, then you have a quiescence error because you're missing the pin at the end of the bishop to the king, and you're winning the bishop, and that's the end of the ball game. So that would be the best sequence. Let's show that in slow motion instant replay again. White queen the pawn, which should win, but better is knight to c6, rook to a2, a8 queen. If rook takes a8, rook takes a8, and now black doesn't have to take the knight, but then he's down a rook anyway, and if he takes the knight, we play rook a6. And that would be the best sequence for white, even better than playing a8 queen right away. A8 queen right away is a very good move. When you see a good move, don't play it. Look for a better one. You're trying to play the best one you can in a reasonable amount of time. So white plays queen. Of course, black has to take. White takes, and black takes the pawn. All right, now if you're white, there's two ways to play this position. You can play defensively and try to get your pieces back and stop that passed h-pawn. Or you can try to race with the h-pawn and queen the e-pawn first. Now normally, you don't want to race when you're winning. If you're winning, you just want to stop your opponent. So normally, if you have an easy way to stop the h-pawn here, you should just go stop the h-pawn and win the game with an extra piece. The problem for white here is his pieces on d8 and a8 are a little bit awkward, and it's a little hard for those pieces to get back to stop the pawn. Now the white king can, but the rook on h2 is temporarily stopping the king from getting into that area. So it actually is the better plan here to try to use your extra piece to either win enough material or promote first with some sort of mating attack, and that would be the best plan. All right, so anyway, white plays the best first move. Knight takes f7 check. If you look in the upper right here for the evaluation, we're now getting into table base area, so the engine's saying that. Let's turn off the table base. If you look at the evaluation now, it says white is up 7.7. So that's a pretty big advantage, but that doesn't mean that he doesn't have to think about what he needs to do, because the advantage is based on the fact that his e-pawn is just as fast as now, if not faster than the h-pawn, but he has to play it that way. So black plays king to g6. And now white could play either e6 or knight d6. They're both equally good. He decides to play knight d6. Engine says, okay, you're still up by 8 pawns. And black says, I have no choice. I need to try to race here. The engine likes king g7, but that's not a very human move. Black plays the human move of playing h4. All right, now, so white has to decide, what's the right plan here? Do I want to race with him, or do I want to play defense? The engine says you can actually kind of do both. Let's look at the best line here. The best line is rook to g8 check. Now notice the king can't go to the f-file. There's no legal squares. So let's say he hits the rook, but then he loses the g-pawn. And now if black tries to keep pushing the h-pawn, white has several ways of doing this. He can play king f4, he can play e6. Let's say he plays e6. If black tries to promote the pawn, let's say plays, he can't move the rook off the h-file because then rook h5 check wins the pawn. If he plays rook h1, white has lots of ways to win. He could just bring the king into the area if he wants to, with king to f2 is a good move. Computer says king f4 is the best. Excuse me. h2. Rook checks, and now as long as black can't check, it's game over. King to g6. Excuse me. Now here the computer likes the cute knight to e4, but that's not a very human move. You could also just sack your rook for the pawn now and get a queen and win with the knight and the pawn. Rook takes, pawn here, rook to e2, pawn queens, rook takes, knight takes. Anytime you have a king and a pawn and anything else against a king, unless it's a very rare position, you're just winning. It doesn't matter. You don't need the opposition or anything because the knight has infinite tempos. If you don't believe me, I have a video called King and Pawn and question mark against King. Good video. All right, let's go back to the game. That's just something that could happen to show you why white's winning easily there. All right, so here white played rook f8 to cut off the king. Perfectly good move. Black plays rook h1. And now again the computer likes rook g8 check again, but once you played rook f8 you're probably not going to find that. You could just play king f2. King f2 keeps the rook off the e-file and stops skewers on the e-file. It also helps the king get over to g2 and fight against that h-pawn. So king f2 is a very logical move. White plays the strange move knight to e4. That does block the e-file from the rook and brings the knight toward the defensive area, but it doesn't really have any great specific threats. Black hits the rook. Now rook f5, winning the g-pawn right away is the best move. White plays rook f6, which also wins, not quite as easily. h3, best try for black. And now white has to start being a little bit careful here. He had some lines earlier where he could push the e-pawn. Now it's getting a little bit tricky. He needs to get his king or his knight into the defensive area. King to f2 seems like a reasonable move. Knight to g3, getting ready to maybe sack the knight is another idea. The computer likes rook f5 as well. If you play knight g3 and he plays rook checks, king f2, rook takes pawn, and now the computer says something like knight checks, king up, king g3, winning the h-pawn, and you're still winning as long as you don't lose your f-pawn in this position. Not as easy as it was before, of course. All right, back to the game. So white plays knight takes g5, and for the first time since he was queening his a-pawn, he's no longer winning here. That move loses a critical tempo for stopping the h-pawn, and now the game should be a draw if black plays correctly. So if we go back a couple moves, let's look at the best sequence. Rook to f5 instead. The idea is if he plays king g6, then rook takes g5 is a check. If he plays h3 here, check. Let's say he plays king h6. And again, we have something like king f4, h2, and then just rook g2. And the poor rook on h1 has no checks. And if he just sits there on h1, you can just push your e-pawn in and get a queen, because the rook on g2 is blocking the black king out of the game, and black's pretty much in Zugzwang here. He has nothing he can do, and the game's over. All right, back to the game. All right, so knight takes g5. Big mistake, throwing away the win, but it wasn't obvious. I think at this point, if I remember, black still had around, I think 5 minutes left with a 10-second time delay. The game was played 65 minutes with a 10-second time delay. So if you're one of those people who plays on chess.com and thinks a 15-10 game is slow, this game is much, much, much slower. This is a 65-10 game. Each side starts the game with 65 minutes. All right, black plays h2. Now the game should be a draw, and white has to be a little careful now because he can't stop that pawn easily. He plays rook checks, king g6, and he plays rook h7, just giving up the knight to stop the h-pawn. Black plays check first, and white guards the knight. But now white will lose the rook after black queens. White takes and black takes. Now white's got the winning chances here with a knight and two pawns against a rook, but it should be a draw with best play. But now white, who still had several minutes left, I was watching the game at this point, and it wasn't like white had 2 seconds left. I mean, maybe he had less than 3 minutes left. But it wasn't like his clock was about to fall. And I saw he made this next move in less than a 10-second increment, if I remember correctly. He played the terrible, terrible move, king to g4. Well, if you watched my video, the geometry of chess tactics, you just lined up your king and your knight on the same line. And of course, that means skewer time. Rook g8 check. Oops. Now all of a sudden white looks at the board like, what did I just do? And now it's going to be an easy win. Black blockades the pawn. He plays rook f8. I think they played a couple more moves, but white was in time trouble and couldn't record them. But let's just show what could happen. Here, white's kind of a little bit in zugzwang. He can't play f5 check. He can't play king d5 because rook takes f4. So let's say he plays e6. Then you just play king f6. If white guards the pawn with f5, you just wait with rook to e8. Let's say white plays king to f4. Now you can get your rook outside, rook to a8, as far away as possible. King to e4, rook checks. He has to give up the pawn. If you take the pawn and he goes here, you play rook a8, he plays king d6, you play king f6, he plays king d7, you play king f7, end of ball game. Next two moves could be rook e8 and rook takes pawn, or rook checks, depending on what white does. And you're winning the pawn in a couple moves here. So even though we don't have any moves after rook f8, this is pretty hopeless. We could try a different move. Let's say instead of e6, we give up the pawn right away. He takes here. Let's say you try to keep his king out with this move. You just play rook here. He hits the rook. You play the rook back. If he brings the king up, you bring the king in. And then you're going to, he's in zugzwang here. If he pushes the pawn, you just attack it twice and you're going to win it on the next move. So it's a pretty easy win. Those two connected pass pawns are not really much of a threat against the king and the rook. If the black king was on a1, well, that would be a whole different ball game. But when the black king is in the area, that's why it's so important when your opponent has these passed pawns to get your king into the defensive area. You don't want to keep it far away. Okay, hopefully you enjoyed today's video. Please tell your friends about the channel, Dan Heisman Chess. If you like the video, you can like it. You can subscribe to the channel. We have about, I don't know, 9,700 subscribers. So if you do subscribe and you haven't subscribed, we can hit that magic 10,000 mark maybe sometime this year. I appreciate it. Hopefully you enjoyed a lot from this game. It's a very instructive game. We'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.